The Malvan left the station 2 days later. Vlith watched their ship depart from an observation deck with Siren standing quietly beside Hargrothuk. Had not shown his face since the incident in the maintenance corridor. Word had spread through the station about what happened, though the details varied wildly depending on who told the story. Some versions claimed Siren had killed one of the Malvan with his bear, and others suggested he was secretly a military operative with classified combat augmentations. A few whispered that humans had hidden psychic abilities that could paralyze enemies with fear. The truth was somehow more impressive and more disturbing than any rumor. One ordinary human had made 3 apex predators run away by simply refusing to be afraid. Vlith completed her diplomatic mission successfully. The trade agreements were signed and sealed, and her superiors back home were pleased with her performance, but she knew her report would contain information far more valuable than shipping rights and tariff structures. She had learned something fundamental about humanity, something the galactic community desperately needed to understand. On her final day at the station, she met Siren in the cargo bay, where they had first encountered each other. His ship was loaded and ready for departure. He looked the same as always, with his simple work clothes and his calm, patient expression. "I want to thank you properly," Velas said. "You saved my life, and you asked nothing in return." Siren shrugged with that characteristic humility she had come to recognize. "You needed help, and I could provide it, and that is enough." "It is not enough for me," Velith insisted. "Among my people, such debts are taken seriously, and I want you to know that. You have a friend in the Salarothi diplomatic corps. I appreciate that." Velith hesitated, and then decided to ask the question that had been bothering her since their conversation about human psychology. "When you stood against the Malvan, were you really prepared to die?" "Yes." Without hesitation. Siren considered the question carefully. "There was hesitation," he admitted. "I am not a machine, and I wanted to live, and I thought about my ship and my cargo routes and the life I had built." "But you stayed." "I stayed because some things matter more than survival," Siren said. "And protecting someone who cannot protect themselves is one of those things." Velith nodded slowly. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed struck her deeply. Humans were not just stubborn, persistent predators. They were creatures capable of placing abstract principles above their own existence. That was rare. It was almost unheard of in the galactic community. Most species fought to survive. Most species ran when the odds turned against them, but humans would apparently die for strangers if they believed the cause was right. "Have one final question," Bella said. "Ask. When you stood in that corridor with your hand near your weapon, what were you thinking?" Siren was quiet for a long moment. His dark eyes grew distant, as if he was looking at something far away. "I was calculating angles," he said finally. "I was measuring distances and estimating reaction times and planning the sequence of attacks that would give me the best chance of hurting them before they killed me." "That sounds very cold." "It was," Siren agreed. "In those moments, I was not really myself anymore, and I was something older and simpler and much more dangerous." He looked at her directly. "Humans have a word for it, though I am not sure how well it translates, and we call it the zone." The zone. A mental state where fear and doubt disappear, and all that remains is focus and purpose and absolute commitment to the task at hand. Siren smiled slightly. "Our ancestors needed that state to hunt creatures that could kill them easily, and we needed to be able to set aside our survival instincts and focus entirely on the kill. And you can access this state, Well, most humans can with training," Siren said. "It is not pleasant, and it leaves you feeling hollow afterward, but it is useful when facing things that want to eat you." Velith filed this information away with everything else she had learned. Humans could voluntarily suppress their fear response. They could enter a mental state, optimized for combat. They would fight to the death for principles, and Strangers, and they had evolved as predators who never stopped pursuing their prey. The galactic databases were catastrophically incomplete. "I will miss you," Valeth said, and the words surprised her, even as she spoke. The Msioran's expression softened. "I will miss you too, and you are braver than you give yourself credit for." "I am not brave," Valeth protested. "I was terrified the entire time, and I froze when the Malvin appeared, and I would have died without your help." "Being terrified and continuing anyway is the definition of courage," Siren replied. "You did not let your fear make you abandon your mission, and you trusted a stranger from a species you barely knew, and you faced predators who have terrorized your kind for millennia." He placed a hand on her shoulder gently. "You are brave, Valeth, and do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Valeth felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. She had spent her whole life feeling inadequate compared to the predator species who dominated galactic politics. She had been told repeatedly that her kind were gentle and diplomatic because they were too weak to be anything else, but here was a human telling her that surviving her fear was its own form of strength. "Thank you," she whispered. They said their farewells, and Siren boarded his ship. Valeth watched it depart into the darkness between stars, and she felt a strange mixture of sadness and hope. 6 months later, Valeth stood before the Celerathi High Council to present her revised cultural assessment of humanity. The chamber was filled with senior diplomats and military advisors and representatives from allied species. All of them waited to hear what she had learned. Humans should not be classified as prey or predator. Valeth declared, "The binary is insufficient to describe what they are." She activated a holographic display showing human evolutionary history. They are persistence predators who evolved to hunt by exhausting their prey over long distances, and this gave them psychological traits that no other known species possesses. The council members leaned forward with interest. They feel fear like any other species, but they have learned to act despite that fear, and more importantly, they have developed cultural and psychological mechanisms that allow them to prioritize principles over survival. "What does this mean practically?" one of the senior diplomats asked. "It means that humans will not back down from threats the way other species do," Valeth explained. "They will not submit to intimidation, and they will not accept being treated as lesser beings. And they will fight even when fighting seems hopeless." She paused to let her words sink in. "But it also means they make the most loyal allies the galaxy has ever seen, because they will stand with their friends against impossible odds, and they will keep standing long after other species would have surrendered." The chamber was silent. "My recommendation is that we pursue closer relations with humanity immediately," Valeth concluded. "They are strange and dangerous and sometimes terrifying, but they are exactly the kind of friends we need in a galaxy full of predators." The vote was unanimous. 3 months after that, a Malvan delegation arrived at a Celerathi colony world with aggressive demands for territorial concessions. The Malvan ambassador was large and scarred and confident in his species' reputation for violence. He expected the Celerathi to submit as they always had instead. Valeth met him at the negotiation table with a calm expression and a datapad containing a single piece of information. "Before we begin," she said pleasantly, "I should inform you that the United Earth government has expressed interest in a mutual defense agreement with the Celerathi people." The Malvan ambassador went very still. "The human delegation arrives next week to finalize the details," Valeth continued. "I am sure they would be fascinated to meet representatives of the Malvan people." The color drained from the ambassador's face. His black eyes showed something Valeth had seen only once before: fear. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we could revisit our initial demands and reach a more equitable arrangement." "I thought you might say that," Valeth replied, smiled, and somewhere across the stars she imagined a human cargo hauler smiling too. The Malvan had learned an important lesson that day. The same lesson Grothic had learned in a dim corridor on a distant station. Some prey was not worth hunting, and some predators wore very convincing disguises. The galaxy was changing, humanity was rising, and species that had preyed on the weak for millennia were beginning to understand that the rules had changed forever. Because now the prey had friends, patient, stubborn, terrifying friends who would never stop coming. They sat in Velith's quarters with the door locked and security. Protocols and gadget. Velith's hands still trembled as she poured water from a container into 2 cups. Sirin sat across from her with his posture relaxed and his terrible patience hidden. Once again, beneath a mask of ordinary comm station security had been notified about the ambush. The Malvin would face consequences for the fake message and the attempted intimidation. But Velith barely cared about any of that. She could not stop thinking about what she had witnessed. "You were going to fight them," she said finally. "Yes, all 3 of them." "Yes." Velith set down her water cup because her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. "You would have died." Sirin considered the statement with the same thoughtful expression he always wore. "Probably," he admitted. "Torvak alone weighs about 400 kilograms, and his claws could take my head off with one swing." "Then why?" Velith demanded, and her voice cracked with emotion. "Why would you stand against them knowing you could not win?" "I did not say I could not win," Sirin corrected gently. "I said I would probably die, and those are different things." Velith stared at him without comprehension. "I would have hurt them before they killed me," Sirin explained. "I would have hurt them badly enough that they remembered it for the rest of their lives, and that memory would make them hesitate the next time. They cornered someone who could not fight back. That makes no sense." Velith protested. "You would sacrifice yourself to teach predators a lesson they might not even learn." "That is what humans do," Sirin said simply. "We are not the strongest or the fastest, but we are very, very stubborn, and sometimes stubborn is enough." He leaned forward with his dark eyes meeting hers directly. "Let me tell you about my species." Velith nodded slowly and settled back to listen. "Humans evolved on a planet called Earth," Sirin began. "It was what the galactic community calls a Class 4 death world with extreme temperature variations and natural disasters and predators everywhere." "I read that in the databases," Velith said. "The databases do not tell the important parts," Sirin replied. "They classify us as omnivores and persistence predators, and they note our moderate physical statistics, and then they move on to more interesting species." He smiled without humor. "But they miss what makes us dangerous." "Tell me," Velith whispered. "We evolved without natural weapons." Sirin said, "No claws and no fangs and no armor and no venom, and we were soft and slow and easily killed by almost everything on our planet." "How did you survive?" "We refused to stop," Sirin answered. "When something tried to kill us, we did not just run and hide, and we followed it, and we learned its patterns, and we figured out how to kill it back." He gestured at his own body with one hand. "This form is optimized for one thing above all others, and that thing is endurance." "Endurance," Velith repeated. "On Earth we hunted by selecting prey, and then following it across the landscape for hours or days until it collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke." Sirin's voice took on a distant quality, as if he was reciting something ancient and fundamental. "Most predators are ambush hunters, and they rely on short bursts of speed and overwhelming force, and if they miss their initial attack, they give up and wait for another opportunity." "Like the Malvin," Velith said. "Exactly like the Malvin." Sirin agreed. "But humans are different, and when we choose prey, we do not give up, and we do not stop, and we do not let them rest." He met her eyes again. "Imagine being a prey animal on ancient Earth, and you see a human in the distance, and you run. And you are faster, so you escape easily, and you hide and you rest, and then you look up, and the human is there again." Velith felt a chill run down her spine. "So you run again, and again you escape, and again you hide, and again you rest, and again you Look up, and the human is still coming. That is terrifying. Velith breathed. It is the most terrifying thing in the universe for a prey animal. Saren confirmed. Because eventually you realize that you cannot escape, and you cannot hide, and no matter how far you run, the human will follow, and sooner or later your body will fail, and when it does, the human will be there. He spread his hands. That is persistence, predation, and that is what humans are, and that is why Grothic's instinct screamed at him when he looked in my eyes. Velith processed this information slowly. But you were not going to chase him across a landscape until he collapsed. No, Saren admitted, but the psychological foundation is the same, and when Grothic looked at me, he saw a creature that would not stop. Would not stop what? Would not stop coming for him. Saren said quietly. Would not stop fighting until one of us was dead, and maybe not even then. He leaned back in his chair. Ambush predators, like the Malvin, are optimized for quick victories, and they see a target, and they evaluate whether they can win easily, and if the answer is no, they move on. And when they looked at you, they saw someone who would not make it easy. They saw someone who would make it as hard as possible. Saren corrected, and more importantly, they saw someone who would not stop coming even after they won. Velith shook her head in confusion. I do not understand that. Humans hold grudges. Saren explained with something. That might have been embarrassment. If you hurt us or hurt someone we care about, we remember, and we plan and we wait, and eventually we find a way to make you regret it. Even if it takes years, even if it takes generations, Saren confirmed. There are human conflicts that lasted for centuries, with each side refusing to forgive wrongs done to their distant ancestors. Velith stared at him with new understanding dawning in her large, dark eyes. That is insane. Yes, Saren agreed cheerfully. Humans are frequently insane by the standards of other species, and that insanity kept us alive long enough to reach the stars. The Malvin sensed this somehow. Predators recognize patterns even when they cannot articulate them, Saren said. Grothak's instincts have been honed by millions of years of evolution, and when he looked at me, those instincts told him that I was not safe prey. But you are small and soft, and you have no natural weapons, and I am patient and stubborn and absolutely willing to die hurting him as badly as I possibly can, Saren finished. That combination does not exist in most prey species, and predators do not know how to handle it. Vela sat in silence for a long moment. Everything she thought she knew about galactic classifications and species hierarchies was crumbling. The Malvin were supposed to be apex predators. They were supposed to be at the top of every food chain they encountered, but they had run from a single human who possessed nothing but determination and a willingness to fight even when fighting meant death. You said bravery without fear is just instinct, Velas said slowly as a memory surfaced. What did you mean? Saren looked surprised. I do not remember saying that. You did not, Velas admitted. But I have been thinking about what I witnessed and I realized something important. What is that? You were afraid, Velas said softly. In that corridor facing 3 Malvin alone, you were afraid. Saren's expression flickered briefly. Yes, he admitted. You stood there anyway, and you did not run, and you did not back down, and you prepared to fight, knowing you would probably die. Yes, why? Velas demanded. If you were afraid, then why not run, and no one would have blamed you, and I certainly would not have expected you to die for me. Saren was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. Because fear does not control us, he said. Not anymore, and maybe not ever, and we feel it like every other species feels it. But we learned long ago that acting despite fear is what separates those who survive from those who do not. He met her eyes directly. I was afraid, and I stood anyway, because standing is what humans do. Velas felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she did not fully understand why she had met warriors from a dozen species. She had studied the martial traditions of cultures across the galaxy, but she had never encountered anything like this, a creature who felt fear and acknowledged fear and then simply refused to let fear make decisions for them. It was the most terrifying and inspiring thing she had ever witnessed. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing." Siren smiled, and finally some warmth returned to his dark eyes. "You are welcome." They sat together in comfortable silence as the station hummed around them, and Velith began to understand why the galaxy might need to revise its opinions about humanity. 3 days passed, and Velith continued her diplomatic work with Siren as her unofficial escort, appeared each morning outside her quarters, and walked with her to her meetings and waited patiently while she negotiated trade agreements. She had offered to pay him for his time, but he refused. "I have cargo scheduled for pickup in 6 days," he explained. "Until then I have nothing but time, and you need someone watching your back." Velith did not argue. She had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, and she found that her fear had diminished significantly since he began accompanying her. The Malvans still appeared sometimes. She would catch glimpses of Grothak watching from distant corridors or sitting in observation areas above the main concourse. But he never approached when Siren was present. He simply watched with those small black eyes, and something that might have been frustration on his massive face on. The 4th day, Velith decided to learn more about her protector. They sat together in a small food court near the administrative section, and she gathered her courage to ask personal questions. "You said you do not like bullies," she began carefully. "That seems like a strong feeling for someone you just met." Siren chewed his food slowly before answering. "I spent 12 years in the United Earth Defense Force," he said. "I saw a lot of bullies in a lot of different forms, and I learned that the only thing bullies understand is someone willing to stand up to them." "You were military," Velith said with surprise. She had assumed he was simply a cargo hauler. Siren nodded. "Infantry, and then special operations, and then I got tired of taking orders from people who had never seen combat." "You have killed before," Velith said. And it was not a question. Yes, the word hung between them. Siren did not elaborate, and his expression gave nothing away. His dark eyes remained calm and steady, as if discussing the weather rather than ending lives. "Does that frighten you?" he asked Velith. Considered the question honestly. "No," she admitted. "Perhaps it should, but no." "Why not?" "Because you have shown me nothing but kindness," she said. "And because I think whatever violence lives inside you is controlled, not chaotic." Something flickered in Siren's eyes. It might have been surprise or appreciation or something else entirely. "That is more perceptive than most people manage," he said. "My species evolved to read others accurately," Velith explained. "Misunderstanding a predator's intentions was usually fatal for my ancestors." Siren smiled slightly. "And what do your instincts tell you about me?" "They are confused," Velith admitted. "You do not feel like a predator when I am with you, and yet when you faced the Malvan, you became something else entirely. Humans are complicated," Siren said, and his smile faded into something more thoughtful. "We are prey-sized but predator-minded, and we spent most of our evolutionary history as both hunter and hunted." Before Velith could ask more questions, her communicator chimed with an urgent message. One of her scheduled meetings had been moved to a different location. The new meeting room was in a maintenance section on the station's outer ring. Siren frowned when she showed him the message. "That area is isolated," he said. "Not many people pass through there." "The message says the primary meeting room had a systems failure," Velith replied, but doubt crept into her voice. "Do you trust the source?" Velith checked the sender information. The message appeared to come from the station's administrative system. "It looks legitimate," she said. Siren stood, and his posture shifted into that alert readiness she had noticed before. "Then we go," he said. "But we stay careful." They walked through increasingly empty corridors. As they approached the outer ring, the lighting grew dimmer, and the foot traffic disappeared. Entire liveless instincts screamed warnings. but she trusted Siren enough to keep moving. They turned a corner into a long maintenance corridor and found 3 Malvin waiting for them. Grothak stood in the center with his massive arms crossed over his chest. 2 other Malvin flanked him. One was slightly smaller, with dark brown fur and eager eyes. The other was enormous, even by Malvin standards, with gray fur and scars covering his face and chest. "I knew you would come," Grothak said, and his voice echoed off the metal walls. Velith felt her legs lock with terror. 3 of them. 3 massive predators in an isolated corridor with no witnesses and no security drones. She was going to die. Siren stopped walking, but he did not retreat. His hand moved slowly to rest near his hip, where Velith noticed for the first time a small holster containing something she could not identify. The message was fake, Siren said calmly. "Obviously," Grothak replied. "You have cost me much enjoyment, human, and I wanted to speak with you properly." "Then speak." Grothak gestured at Velith with one massive claw. "The prey belongs to me, and you have interfered with my hunt, and that is not acceptable." "She is not prey," Siren said, and his voice hardened slightly. "She is a diplomatic representative of the Celerothi people, and she is under my protection." "Your protection?" The scarred Malvin laughed, and his voice was like grinding stones. "1 human against 3 Malvin, and you think you offer protection?" Siren did not respond to the taunt. Instead, he stepped forward. Velith watched in horror as he placed himself directly between her and 3 creatures that could tear him apart in seconds. His posture changed. It was subtle at first. His shoulders dropped slightly, and his knees bent, and his weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet. His breathing slowed until his chest barely moved, and his eyes. Velith stared at his eyes and felt her blood run cold. The warmth vanished, the kindness disappeared. What remained was something ancient and terrible, something that had no mercy and no hesitation and no doubt. Siren's gaze locked onto Grothak with absolute focus. Then it moved to the scarred Malvin, then to the smaller one. He was evaluating them. He was prioritizing targets. He was deciding which one to hurt first. The smaller Malvin shifted uncomfortably. His eager expression faded into uncertainty. The scarred Malvin, who had laughed moments ago, stopped laughing. His nostrils flared as some deep instinct processed what his eyes were seeing. Grothak stood very still. "What are you?" he asked, and for the first time his voice held something other than arrogance. Siren did not answer immediately. He simply stood there with that terrible patience radiating from every line of his body. The silence stretched. Velith could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She could smell the fear pheromones beginning to leak from the Malvin, from the Movan. Apex predators were afraid. "You asked me once what humans are," Siren finally said, and his voice was flat and cold. "We are persistence predators." He took another step forward. "We evolved on a world where we were not the strongest or the fastest or the most armored." Another step, but we were patient. The Malvin shifted backward almost imperceptibly. On our world, we would choose our prey, and then we would follow it for hours or days or weeks. Siren's head tilted slightly like a predator examining something interesting. We did not need to catch our prey immediately, and we just needed to keep following until it collapsed from exhaustion. His voice dropped lower. "We hunted things 10 times our size this way, and we hunted things with fangs and claws and armor, and we hunted them to extinction." The scarred Malvin's breathing had become rapid and shallow. His massive body trembled with conflicting impulses. "You are ambush predators," Siren continued. "You rely on fear and quick kills and overwhelming force." He smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "But what do you do when the prey does not run?" Grothak's black eyes were wide now. "What do you do when it follows you instead?" The smaller Malvin broke first. He turned and fled down the corridor with his claws scraping against the metal floor. The scarred Malvin lasted 3 more seconds before his instincts overpowered his pride. He backed away slowly and then faster, and then he too was gone only. Grothic remained the massive hunter, stood alone facing a creature less than half his size, and he was afraid. "We are done here," Siren said quietly. Grothic nodded once. His movements were jerky and uncertain as he stepped aside to let them pass as Veleth walked by on trembling legs. She heard Grothic whisper something to Siren. "What are you really?" Siren glanced back with those cold, patient eyes. "I'm what happens when prey refuses to be prey anymore." Then he took Veleth's arm gently and guided her down the corridor towards safety. Behind them, Grothic stood alone in the dim lighting with his ancient predator instincts, screaming warnings about a small, soft creature that had no right to be so terrifying. He had hunted across 12 star systems, had never been hunted before until now. Grothic had hunted across 12 star systems in his long and violent life. He had taken prey on frozen moons and burning deserts and in the depths of space itself. He had killed creatures twice his size, and he had broken the spirits of beings who thought themselves brave. Fear was his weapon, and he wielded it with the skill of a master craftsman. He had never hesitated before. He stood now in an empty cargo bay far from the place where he had encountered the human, and his massive hands trembled. It was something he did not want to name. His hunting partner, Carveth, found him there 20 minutes later. Carveth was younger and smaller, but he was still enormous by the standards of most species. He looked at Grothic with confusion in his black eyes. "You found the prey," Carveth said. "I smelled her fear from 3 corridors away, and then you let her go." Grothic did not answer immediately. He was still trying to understand what had happened. He had been so certain of his victory. The Sarathi female was perfect prey. She was small and soft and terrified. She had no weapons and no protectors, and she practically radiated vulnerability. He had followed her for 3 days and savored her growing panic like a fine wine, and then the human appeared. Grothic had not considered the human a threat. At first, humans were small and weak and unremarkable. The galactic databases said they were persistence hunters from a mid-level death world, but that meant nothing. Persistence hunting was the strategy of this desperate. It was what prey species did when they lacked the tools to fight back properly. A true predator did not need to chase its food for hours. A true predator killed quickly and efficiently. But when Grothic looked into the human's eyes, something deep inside him went cold. The human showed no fear. That alone was unusual, but not unheard of. Some species simply lacked the ability to recognize threats. Some were too stupid to understand when they were in danger. But the human was not stupid. The human understood exactly what was happening. Grothic saw it in those dark brown eyes. The human knew that Grothic could kill him with a single blow. Human knew that he was facing a creature 3 times his size with claws that could tear through metal. Human knew all of this, and he did not care more than that. The human looked at Grothic with something that made every hunting instinct in his body scream a warning. The human looked at him like prey. It was not aggression or challenge or territorial display. Grothic had faced all of those before, and they did not trouble him. This was something different. This was evaluation. The human's eyes moved across Grothic's body with calm precision. They noted the position of his limbs and the angle of his joints and the placement of his center of mass. The human was measuring him. The human was calculating. The human was deciding how to kill him. Grothic had been the hunter for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be assessed as a target. But he recognized the look because he had given it to 1,000 victims over the years. And somehow, impossibly, this small, soft creature was giving it to him. There was something wrong with his eyes. Grothic finally said to Carveth. His voice was rough and uncertain. "The human?" Carveth asked. "What about him?" "He looked at me the way I look at prey," Grothic said, and the admission tasted like ash in his mouth. Carveth made a sound of disbelief. "Humans are barely civilized, and they have no natural weapons, and they die from diseases that other species shrug off." "I know what the databases say," Grothic growled. "I also know what I saw." He turned to face his hunting partner with his black eyes hard. "When you look at prey, what do you see?" Carveth shrugged. "Fear and weakness and meat. And when prey looks at you, what do you see in their eyes?" "Terror," Carveth said with a grin. "They freeze or run or beg, and it is delicious." Grothok nodded slowly. The human did none of those things, and when I looked into his eyes, I did not see terror or defiance or even courage. He paused, and his voice dropped to a whisper. I saw patience. Carveth's grin faded. "I do not understand, neither do I," Grothok admitted. "But I have hunted long enough to know. When something is wrong and everything about that human was wrong." He began pacing the cargo bay with his massive form, casting shadows across the metal walls. His breathing did not change when he saw me, and his heart rate stayed steady, and his body showed no signs of the fear response that every prey species displays. "Perhaps humans simply lack fear," Carveth suggested. "No," Grothok shook his head. "I have seen humans afraid before, and they react like any other species. And this one was not afraid because he did not see me as a threat." The words hung in the air between them. Carveth looked troubled now. "That is not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There is more," Grothok continued. "When I looked at him closely, I noticed his stance and his weight distribution and the way his hand moved toward his hip, and he was not preparing to defend." He stopped pacing and faced Carveth directly. He was preparing to attack. "One human against a Malvan," Carveth scoffed, but the scoff was hollow. "One human who looked at me like I was already dead." Grothok replied, "One human who was calculating exactly how to take me apart." The cargo bay fell silent somewhere. In the distance, a ventilation fan hummed steadily. "What do we do?" Carveth finally asked. Grothok considered the question carefully. His pride demanded that he prove his dominance over this small creature who had dared to make him feel something he had not felt in decades, but his instincts whispered a different message. His instincts told him that this human was dangerous in a way that size and strength could not measure. "We watch," Grothok decided. "We observe and we learn, and we bring Torvak with us next time." Torvak was the third member of their hunting pack. He was the largest Malvan on the station, and he had never backed down from any challenge. "3 of us against 1 human," Carveth said, and some of his confidence returned. Grothok nodded, but deep inside he was not so certain. There was something about that human that did not fit the categories. He understood predators and prey, strong and weak, hunter and hunted. These were the simple divisions that had governed Grothok's entire existence, but the human seemed to exist outside those categories. Entirely, he was small but not weak. He was soft but not vulnerable. He was prey-shaped but predator-souled, and those patient, watchful eyes kept appearing in Grothok's mind no matter how hard he tried to forget them. Meanwhile, in a different part of the station, Velith sat in her quarters and tried to process what she had witnessed. The human Kang. Saren had escorted her safely back to the main corridors and then excused himself to return to his cargo work. He had been polite and professional and entirely unremarkable in every way, except one. She could not stop thinking about the moment when Grothok backed away. It made no sense. The Malvan were feared throughout the galaxy for good reason. They were massive and aggressive and utterly without mercy. They had conquered entire systems through pure physical dominance, and one of them had retreated from a single unarmed humanvolith, pulled up the galactic database on her personal terminal, and searched for information about humanity. The files were surprisingly thin for a species that had been part of galactic civilization for 2 centuries. Humans originated from a planet called Earth. They were classified as omnivores with a tendency toward pack behavior. They had moderate intelligence and moderate physical capabilities and moderate everything else. Nothing special, nothing noteworthy, nothing that explained what she had seen. But buried deep in the biological assessment files, she found something interesting, a single line that had been flagged by some long-forgotten researcher. Humans are classified as persistence predators, meaning they evolve to hunt by following prey until it collapsed from exhaustion rather than through ambush or direct confrontation. Velith read the line 3 times. She did not fully understand what it meant, but something about it made her fur stand on end. She needed to know more. She needed to understand what kind of creature she had stumbled upon, and somewhere deep in her prey species' mind a small voice whispered that perhaps she should be very careful about the answer, because the galaxy was full of predators. But she had never met one who could make another predator back away with nothing but a look, and that terrified her in ways she could not quite explain. The trading station hung in the darkness between stars, like a metal flower waiting to bloom. Velith Tan stepped off her shuttle and felt the cold, recycled air wash over her silver fur for the first time. She was young by Silrathi standards, and this was her first solo diplomatic mission. Her hooves clicked against the metal floor as she walked through the arrival corridor, and her large dark eyes took in everything around her. The station was called Nexus Point, and it served as neutral ground for dozens of species who wanted to trade without the complications of territory or politics. Velith had studied the station layouts and memorized the names of every species she might encounter. She felt prepared. She felt confident. She did not feel the eyes watching her from across the crowded main hall. The Silrathi were a graceful people who resembled the deer of Earth if deer stood on 2 legs and wore diplomatic robes. They'd evolved as prey animals on a world filled with predators, and their survival instincts remained sharp even after 10,000 years of civilization. Velith's ears rotated slightly as she walked, and her nose twitched at the 1,000 different scents filling the air. She smelled metal and oil and food from a dozen worlds. She smelled the sharp musk of Torvine merchants and the floral sweetness of Kamathi traders, and beneath all of that she smelled something that made her legs want to run. It was a predator scent. Her training told her to stay calm because predator species were common in galactic society, and most of them had learned to control their hunting instincts centuries ago. But her instincts screamed something different. Instincts told her that something was hunting her right now. She kept walking toward the administrative section where she would register for her meetings. Her diplomatic mission was simple enough. The Silrathi wanted to establish a new trade route through this sector, and she needed to negotiate passage rights with 3 different species. It should take 5 days at most. She had done the research and prepared her arguments and brought gifts appropriate to each culture. Everything was planned perfectly. She did not plan for the Malvin. Velith first saw him when she stopped at a food vendor to purchase a simple meal. He stood near a support pillar about 50 meters away, and he was watching her. Malvin were massive creatures who resembled armored bears with 6 limbs and jaws that could crush starship hull plating. They were apex predators from a high-gravity death world, and they had conquered space through sheer aggression and physical dominance. This one was large, even by Malvin standards. His name was Grothak, though Velith would not learn this until later. His fur was dark brown with patches of gray that spoke of age and experience. His eyes were small and black, and they tracked her movements with obvious interest. Velith felt her heart begin to race. She told herself there was nothing to fear, because violence was forbidden on the station, and security drones patrolled every corridor. But her body did not listen to logic. Her body remembered millions of years of running from things that wanted to eat her. She finished her meal quickly and moved toward her assigned quarters. When she glanced back, the Malvin had moved closer. He was following her over the next 2 days. Velith tried to focus on her diplomatic work. She met with the Torvine Trade Consortium and made progress on shipping rights. She spoke with Kamathi representatives about tariff structures. She reviewed documents and sent reports back to her superiors. And everywhere she went, the Malvin was there. He never spoke to her directly. He never made any threatening moves. He simply watched. He appeared in corridors she walked through. He sat in observation areas overlooking meeting rooms she used. He stood near exits. She approached station Security told her they could not act unless he committed an actual violation. Watching someone was not a crime, they said. Violet knew what this was. The Malvan were known for this behavior. They selected targets and stalked them for days or weeks before making a move. It was how they hunted on their homeworld. They followed prey until it was exhausted and terrified, and then they struck. The fact that civilized society frowned on eating other sentient beings had not eliminated the instincts. Some Malvans simply enjoyed the fear. They fed on it like a drug. Rothak was feeding on her fear, and she could not stop providing it. On the third day, Velith found herself in a cargo bay near the station's outer ring. She had taken a wrong turn while trying to avoid her stalker, and now she was lost in a maze of shipping containers. Her communicator showed weak signal this deep in the station. Her legs trembled as she tried to find her way back to the main corridors. That was when she met the human. Yup was sitting on a cargo crate, eating something from a metal container. He was small compared to most species she had encountered, perhaps 1.8 meters tall, with brown skin and black hair cut very short. He wore simple work clothes stained with grease, and his hands were rough from labor. Yumambalith knew about humans, though she had never met one in person. They were a relatively new species on the galactic stage, having achieved faster than light travel only 2 centuries ago. The galactic database classified them as omnivores with persistence hunting ancestry. They were considered unremarkable in most physical categories: average strength, average speed, short lifespans. No natural weapons worth mentioning. The human looked up as she approached, and his eyes were dark brown and calm. He noticed her distress immediately. His expression shifted from relaxed to alert in a single heartbeat. "You are frightened," he said. It was not a question. Velith hesitated because she did not want to appear weak, but she also desperately needed help. "There is a Malvan," she said, and her voice trembled despite her efforts to control it. "He has been following me for 3 days, and I cannot make him stop, and I am afraid." The human set down his food and stood up slowly. "Where is he now?" he asked. "I do not know," Velith admitted. "I was trying to avoid him, and I got lost, and now I do not know where I am or where he is." The human nodded, and something in his posture changed. It was subtle. His shoulders settled slightly, and his weight shifted to the balls of his feet. His eyes scanned the cargo bay with quick, efficient movements. "My name is Kang Siren," he said. "I haul cargo on an independent freighter, and I know this station well enough to get you back to the main corridors." "Why would you help me?" Velith asked, because kindness from strangers made her suspicious. Siren shrugged. "Because you need help, and I am here, and I do not like bullies." It seemed too simple to be true, but Velith had no better options. She nodded, and the human began walking toward a corridor she had not noticed before. She followed close behind him. They walked in silence for several minutes through narrow passages between towering stacks of cargo containers. Siren moved with quiet confidence, and Velith found herself calming slightly in his presence. Then they turned a corner, and Grothik was there. The Malvan blocked the corridor completely. His massive body filled the space from wall to wall, and his black eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. He had been waiting for her. He had known where she would go. Velith froze. Every muscle in her body locked tight with terror. Her vision narrowed until all she could see was teeth and claws and death. But Siren did not freeze. The human kept walking forward. He moved past Velith and placed himself between her and the Malvan. Did not run. He did not show fear. He simply stood there looking up at a creature 3 times his size. And something strange happened. Grothak hesitated. The massive predator, who had hunted across 12 star systems, looked down at the small human, and something flickered in his black eyes. It looked almost like confusion. It looked almost like fear. Siren said nothing. He simply met the Malvan's gaze and waited. Moments stretched into eternity. Ben Grothak stepped aside. "I have other business," the Malvan growled, and his voice was rough and uncertain. He walked past them without another word, and disappeared into the maze of cargo containers. Veleth stared after him, with her mouth hanging open. She could not understand what had just happened. She turned to look at Siren and found him watching the place where Grothek had vanished. His expression was calm, but his eyes held something she had not noticed before, something cold and patient and deeply unsettling. "What did you do?" she whispered. Siren turned to face her, and the coldness vanished behind a small smile. "Nothing," he said. "I just stood there." "That is not possible," Veleth insisted. "The Malvin fear nothing, and no one, and he backed away from you." The human began walking again and gestured for her to follow. "Predators recognize other predators," he said simply. Veleth hurried after him with her mind racing. Humans were not predators. Every database in the galaxy said so, but something had happened in that corridor, something she did not understand. She was beginning to suspect that the galactic databases were very, very wrong.